Thanks for tuning in to the Urban Scope podcast. I'm back with more NFL news, or better yet, an NFL topic. Now, Myles Garrett recently was asked about his Mount Rushmore of pass rushing defensive linemen. Now, so this is another Mount Rushmore debate, of course, that's been going around. And they asked Myles Garrett this because he's on the fringe of breaking the all time sack record for a season, which is which is held currently by Michael Strahan and TJ Watt. The record is 22 sacks. So 22 and a half sacks, I believe. So he needs another sack to get there. And he only has one game left. So they asked him this question in reference to that, which to me is a very difficult discussion because if you're going to be technical about it, you can't include those linebackers who really were pass rushers. So some of those greats like Von Miller and Terrell Suggs, Lawrence Taylor, the Derek Thomases that we've seen, you can't include them in the discussion because technically they were listed as linebackers and not defensive linemen. So his list only considered true defensive ends and defensive tackles. So that makes it very difficult because those pass rushers like Lawrence Taylor, it was just because of scheme, because they ran a 3-4. So he had to be considered a linebacker, so to speak, in title. But we know he was a pass rusher. He was mostly a defensive end. Well, you can pretty much play him anywhere because his physicality and his skill set and his ability. But that's just a side note for the topic because I really wanted to include those guys. But when I thought about it, I said those guys are not listed as defensive linemen. They're listed as linebackers, which is, just technicality. But just for the sake of argument, we're just going to list those because he listed his favorite, Myles Garrett listed his favorite or Mount Rushmore of defensive linemen, which is Reggie White, which he's the all-time sack leader. Especially in the era, it was amazing for what he did. 200 sacks in an era where it was mostly a running back league, and most people ran the football primarily and only threw the football as novelty type things and long passing yards, and when it was absolutely necessary. But they was running football back then on 3rd and 5. They didn't care. So it was very amazing for what Reggie White was able to do in the era where it was primarily about rushing the football and defense. Um, he listed Aaron Donald, which is a no-brainer. One of the best defensive tackle we've ever seen, one of the most productive defensive tackle, one of the most athletic and most physically gifted one as well. There's not been a lot of defensive tackles with abs. Now, when you think about defensive tackles, you think about the big guys with the stomachs hanging over the bellies. They might be more athletic than the average big guys, but for the most part, they don't look like, if you see them on the street, they don't look like football players. But when you see Aaron Donald, you would think he was just a bodybuilder or something, but he was one of the greatest defensive tackle of all time. And then you can put him in so many different places. He just didn't play defensive tackle. Sometimes they would put him on defensive end. They would put him in linebacker spots, but his title was defensive tackle, and he was the greatest defensive player I've ever seen play. And I'll talk about a little bit more about that in a little bit. He named Warren Sapp, who Warren Sapp is one of those guys that looks like the typical defensive tackle. He doesn't look athletic, but he can move fast. He can get to the quarterback. He was very agile, especially for a big guy at defensive tackle. He was probably one of the most feared during his era of football, playing an era with, Ray Lewis and not Ed Reed, but Ray Lewis and all those different guys that he played with. He was one of the, most feared defensive linemen that you can think of, especially in the era where all of these rules did exist to protect the quarterback. That was pretty much, hurting quarterbacks and throwing them all over the field. So Warren Sapp was another one. And then he named himself, which I think if he keeps on this trajectory of where he's going, he'll be in that greatest conversation. I think he still has a little bit more to go. But of course, he's going to name himself. And I don't blame him because he's been phenomenal, especially, with his physicality and the way he's been able to be so productive, even in a system where he's usually losing games because of their offense. and he's not able to rush the quarterback as much as he would like. So if his team was actually winning more, he would actually probably have about 30 sacks now, because teams would be down and would be passing the football more. But at the end of the games, they're running the football, and he doesn't get a lot of opportunity to rush the quarterback. So it just shows you how productive he is, or how productive he has to be early to actually accumulate these stats, because he's not in an advantageous position to get these sacks. So I think it's a great list that he put together. I have a little bit slightly different list, but of course they don't include like the Derek Thomas and the Lawrence Taylors and all those guys. But I had Reggie White on my list as well, because of what he's been able to do throughout his career and how productive he was in the era that existed. That has to be taken into account. Even though I never seen Reggie White play, but the stats speak for itself and the situation speaks for itself. So I really don't have to see him play. Seeing highlights and stuff like that on YouTube, which you have that privilege today to be able to go back there to that era and watch them play and see how what their skill set was, and he was just a physical guy, especially being underdrafted and everything like that. For him to make such a productive career, he was one of the greatest ever to do it. So you have to add him. I've added Michael Strahan is the only person on my list that he doesn't have, and that's the guy who currently has the record. The system that he was in with the Giants, uh, how he was able to stand out, and he played around so many great defensive linemen and great defensive players, especially in a system that was mostly for offense. He was definitely a game changer. Most people know him more now as a personality opposed to a football player because of what he's doing on TV and what he's doing as a commentator and an analyst and things like that. Most people in today's era know him as that. But growing up, Michael Strahan was one of those guys I definitely watched football for, especially on the defensive side of the football. Most of the time, there's not a lot of defensive players that you watch and go see. I mean, back in the day, it was Lawrence Taylor, and then you had Deion Sanders, but then you have people like Michael Strahan, and you have people like Aaron Donald, who changes that perception of defensive players. They can be box office too. You can watch them on television as well. So Michael Strahan was definitely that. And then for him to get the sack record and how productive he was, you definitely have to put him in there. Of course, I have Aaron Donald on my list as well, because Aaron Donald was just must see TV anytime I watched the Rams play, but especially before they got Matt Stafford, I was watching the defense play, and then I would turn the TV when the offense was on, just because it was just that phenomenal to watch Aaron Donald play. And I think he retired a little too early, but him to put up 100 plus sacks in his career, especially as a defensive tackle, has just been phenomenal. And also, for him to put up 20 sacks in a season, he almost hit the record himself, that Myles Garrett is currently seeking. But for him to do that with all the double teams and triple teams, it just shows that he was pretty much unguardable. Um, how explosive he was off the football, and what that's a big thing about these defensive linemen is how explosive can you get off the football, because those offensive linemen are backpedaling, and you have to get them out of their stance quick or beat them off their stance to actually get a jump start on the quarterback. Because we know these quarterbacks are getting the football out in less than 3 seconds. So you have about 3 seconds to get to the quarterback if you're lucky, if you have great enough secondary play. So it's phenomenal what these defensive linemen are doing, especially in the middle of the offensive line, where you have all these 300-pound guys trying to stop you from getting this quarterback in 3 seconds. So it's just phenomenal to think about. But Aaron Donald's one of those players you can't tell the story of the NFL without. And then I have Warren Sapp on my list as well. Growing up watching him, seeing how big of a guy he was, but how he could move and how skillful he was, how he wasn't lazy at all. He was very determined. He had a high motor, especially for a guy that size, and it's very unique for a guy that size to move that fast and be able to not run out of energy like that, especially in an era where he was also a run stopper. Warren Sapp was one of the best run stoppers ever. Um, that I've seen play at the defensive tackle position, because most people are heading out to just go get the quarterback, but he was trying to stop it all. So he would get the quarterback sacks, he would get the tackles for losses and things like that. He was a phenomenal player. And if you look at him, you wouldn't think he would be able to do that, but um, he defined gravity or physics by what he was able to do in that football field. So I think Aaron I like Myles Garrett's list. Um, like I said, the only difference I had was I added Michael Strahan and I took out him because I think he still has a lot more to go. And but he's on a great path to being one of those great defensive linemen, and we'll see where it goes from there. So we'll see if he'll get that sack record this weekend. He only has one more game to do it, so hopefully he can get that record. But thanks for tuning into the Urban Scope podcast, and until next time, I'll see you next time.